Let me go ahead and start the recording and welcome everyone today to our Zoom event with Iain Murray. My name is Tom Giovanetti. I'm the president of the Institute for Policy Innovation. We are a 33-year-old free market think tank based in Dallas, Texas. And I welcome you all to join us today with our program with Iain Murray on his new book, The Socialist Temptation. We miss being able to see you all in person, but in the meantime, we're thankful for this Zoom technology that allows us to still stay connected and still deliver really great programs. And, you know, there's something to be said for being able to bring someone like Iain Murray to our audience without him having to get on a plane, take 2 days out of his schedule, and all of that. So I imagine this will be a permanent feature of the think tank world going forward to some degree. I want to thank those of you who chose to make a donation to IPI when you registered for this event. We very much appreciate that. And for those of you who purchased copies of Iain's book, we'll be getting those out to you shortly. If after this program you'd like to have a copy of Iain's book, we can arrange that for you. Just contact Addie Crimmins here at IPI. Her email address is in the event confirmation that you got for this event. So just contact her and she'll be happy to set you up with a copy of the book. Today's event is a webinar, not a Zoom meeting. So for those of you who've been faithfully attending our Zoom events, this one's a little bit different. Only the panelists are on video. If you're attending, your video is off and your microphone is muted. There are two ways to ask questions. One is through the Q&A function down at the bottom menu of your Zoom window, where you'll be able to type in a question. So you don't have to ask it yourself. If you prefer to ask it yourself, you can go to the participants menu. You can click on raise your hand and you'll show up in a queue. And at some point we will acknowledge you to ask your own question over audio. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we possibly can. I also want to take this opportunity to talk about our next event. Our next event is going to be a little bit different. It's not going to really be a policy discussion. It's going to be more of a political discussion. We are doing a pregame show and social hour before the first presidential debate next Tuesday, September 29th. We will have three special guests for that program. We'll have Mark Davis, the host of the Mark Davis Show on 660 The Answer AM here in Dallas, and he's also a Dallas Morning News columnist. We will have Matt Makoviak. He's the chairman of the Travis County Republican Party and a Washington Times columnist. And then we will have Wade Emmert. He is currently the general counsel of the Republican Party of Texas. He's the former Dallas County GOP chair, and he is a current board member of the Institute for Policy Innovation. So we envision this as sort of a social hour. So wear your political garb, wear your hats, pop some popcorn, maybe pour out a drink or two, and we'll have a little bit of a social time before we actually start a discussion about the presidential race and the debate. It's going to be great fun, and I hope as many of you as possible can join us. And you can register for that event now. It's free. You can register for that event now at our website at ipi.org. And with that, we'll get on to our program. As it says in the description of Iain Murray's new book, it's back. And he's talking about socialism. Socialism was an economic, moral, and political failure, and 30 years ago, it was thrown on the ash heap of history after the fall of the Berlin Wall. We thought it was done for good, but yet it's back. And particularly with young people, there's a generation of young people who don't remember the misery that socialism inflicted all over the world where it was embraced, in Russia and Eastern Europe, but it's being embraced again. And it's quite stunning to many of us because some of the people who are so enthusiastic about socialism today are blind somehow to the extreme wealth and innovation and high living standards that capitalism has caused, again, everywhere capitalism has been implemented in the world. And so Iain Murray has written a very timely book, it just came out in July, I believe, called The Socialist Temptation. Why is socialism this constant recurring temptation to people? Does it work? Does it always cause totalitarian government anywhere that it's implemented? And such topics as that. And Iain is the perfect person to talk about this. He was born in the United Kingdom. He lived under British socialism as a young man. It says on his book jacket that he had to do his homework by candlelight very often in England. I'm sure we'd like to know more about that. He served in both the Thatcher and John Major governments in the UK before coming to the US. And having grown up in socialized England, he has seen firsthand how well, or the contrary, I guess, how well socialism performs in practice. Today, Iain is a vice president at the Competitive Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., and Iain knows how to write provocative book titles. He is also the author of a book called Stealing You Blind: How Government Fat Cats Are Getting Rich Off of You. That's a great title. And he's also the author of The Really Inconvenient Truths: 7 Environmental Catastrophes Liberals Don't Want You to Know About Because They Helped Cause Them. So how's that for a couple of very provocative book titles? We're really delighted to have Iain Murray with us today. Iain, tell us a little bit about your book. Tell us about the sort of the central arguments of the book, and then we'll have an interesting Q&A with our audience afterward. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, for having me today. It's a delight to be with you down there in Texas, and at some point I must actually get on a plane and come and visit you. But in the meantime, let's do it this way. As you said, socialism is back. We thought it was dead when the Berlin Wall came down, and the few survivors like Cuba and North Korea would just wither on the vine. New socialist countries like Venezuela and Zimbabwe were going exactly the way we'd expect. Yet polling data shows that socialism is more popular now than ever in America. While there's a strong link to college campuses, it's not confined to there. Millennials are favorable to socialism, and some of them are now approaching their 40s. So what happened? It's to answer that question that I wrote The Socialist Temptation. One thing we should get out of the way first. Socialism does mean different things to different people. And in the book, I outline several different forms. We can start with the classical definition of socialism. To put it bluntly, classical socialism is all about popular control or ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange. That's a classical definition of socialism. But there are several different forms beyond that. There is revolutionary socialism. This is the socialism that Marx envisaged, which would be imposed by a dictatorship of the proletariat, imposed after a revolution. This would lead, in Marx's belief, to communism, which is the evolved form of the socialist state. In the evolved form of the socialist state, as it actually occurred, was exemplified by communist countries like the Soviet Union and Maoist China, where party membership was all important, and I'll get onto that a bit again a bit later. But there is also another form, democratic socialism. That was what much of Western Europe turned to after the Second World War. As you say, I grew up in a democratic socialist country. The idea was that the democratic socialists would win elections and then use the agreed upon legislative process to pass laws that would result in popular control of the means of production, distribution, and exchange. What this led to, certainly in my experience in Britain, was a very dreary and depressing place where innovation was suppressed and where aspiration was looked down upon. For instance, when I was young, I remember traipsing around gas board showrooms with my parents because if you wanted to get a new gas heating system in your house, you had to make an appointment, go and see the very few products on offer at the gas showroom, put your order in and then wait for months and months and months until they finally got round to sending the workmen in to install the new gas heating system. Similar things happened in all the other utilities and services. You know, you were restricted to one model of phone, and you had to wait for the post office to come and install. Sorry, not only did you have to wait, but you had to justify to the post office your need for a second phone. For instance, a friend of mine, his parents, the father spent a lot of time away on business. And so the mother wanted a phone in the bedroom so she could talk to him late at night, and she had to justify this to the post office who ran the phone system. And of course, the railways. I had to go to school by rail. The railways were always late. The public ownership degraded the condition of the infrastructure. And if you wanted to eat something on a long train journey, you were forced to resort to the famous British rail sandwich, which is one thin slice of ham between two curling pieces of stale bread. And this was legendary, the British rail sandwich. And then, of course, finally, as you mentioned, I had to do my homework by candlelight. That's because the coal workers, the coal miners and the power workers would regularly go on strike for more pay, which of course, because they were nationalized industries, they got from the pay came from the government and not from the customer. So, so as a result, in the dark evenings of northern Britain, I had to do my homework by candlelight because we had no electricity on regular occurrences. So that's what life was like in democratic socialist Britain. It came to a head in 1979, when so the winter of 1978-79, which was known as the winter of discontent. Most municipal workers went on strike, hospital porters went on strike, and even the municipal grave diggers went on strike. So hospitals were reduced to emergency service only because the municipal garbage collectors were on strike. Garbage was piled up 6 feet high in the streets, and the dead were lying unburied for weeks on end. And that's when the British people finally turned around and said, "That's it. We've had enough of democratic socialism. We're going to elect Margaret Thatcher on a policy of rolling back the state," and that's what happened. In other countries, they had similar experiences, but they chose to go a slightly different direction. And that's another form of socialism, which is called social democracy. That's essentially when you have a very large welfare state, but you pay for that large welfare state by having a large and vibrant capitalist free market economy. And that's where, for instance, Sweden went and Denmark went when they rejected democratic socialism at about the same time. There are other forms of socialism today, but those are the three main ones. Now, American socialists today always call themselves democratic socialists, but when pressed, they disavow the democratic socialism as properly understood, the workers' popular control of the means of production, distribution, and exchange, and say they want to be social democracies like Sweden or Denmark. But then when you look at the policies that Sweden and Denmark have, policies like school choice, universal school choice, a policy whose introduction, by the way, was backed by the teachers' unions in Sweden. They privatized large parts of their social security programs. They have very high taxes in order to pay for this welfare state, not just on the rich, but on the middle class. And when you look at the policies that that Sweden and Denmark have, and compare them to the policies advanced by the Democratic Socialists of America, you see then they're not the same. The Democratic Socialists of America policies are generally those that would lead to the democratic socialist state that like Britain that I mentioned earlier. So the democratic socialists are either confused or disingenuous about that. Let's take a step back here and get back to the original question. Why is socialism, however defined, so attractive to Americans today? I think the first thing to answer is, why does the socialism of the past get a free pass? And the answer to this, I think, has been very well explained by Dr. Christian Niemitz of the Institute of Economic Affairs in London. He says that he's gone through the history of socialist regimes and has identified a three-part process. The first process is when the first part of the process is when a new socialist state is set up. Everybody says, "This is it. This is socialism at last. This is a new dawn. This is the International Brotherhood of Man. Finally here, we're going to see real socialism." Then a few years later, when the internal contradictions of socialism that I talk about in the Socialist Temptation start to come to bear, the wheels start to come off the economy. And it's at that point that they turn around and say, well, this can't be the fault of socialism. Socialism is perfect. So it must be the fault of saboteurs or wreckers or foreign agents or the CIA. Yeah, I think that's where we are with Venezuela at the moment. Any democratic socialist worth his salt will tell you that what's happening in Venezuela is all the fault of the CIA and not the fault of the Maduro regime. And then finally, the third part of the process, when everything has gone to hell in a handbasket, when the economy has completely collapsed, when in the worst cases there may be many thousands dead, that's when the same people who hailed the birth of real socialism, they turn around and say, well, that wasn't real socialism. The only reason it failed was because it wasn't real socialism. So this essentially gives socialism a get out of jail free card, because if socialism fails, it can't be real socialism. So just ignore all those deaths and disasters associated with previous socialist regimes. We're going to get it right this time, and this may actually be why Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and her allies feel able to say that they're not Reds, they're not communists. They genuinely believe that this time is different.
This has sort of become a running joke, hasn't it? That you know, we as capitalists and believers in the free market, we point to the Soviet Union and we say, you know, that experiment's been run, and we point to Venezuela and everywhere else, and they always come back and say, well, they didn't really implement it properly, right? Or they corrupted it or something like that.
This is exactly it. You see it time and time again, that any example of socialism in action is just dismissed as not being real socialism. Yet, and this is the great insight that Christian brought to this. He went back to the sources and found the same people saying, yes, this is real socialism, when the socialist regime was set up. So you know, we have the historical evidence to pin them on this.
Why do you think what you're describing is almost like an abstract, idealized utopian vision that the proponents have? Where do you think that comes from?
Well, you know, I think you're exactly right. I think that there is a feeling that man is perfectible, and that man has the rational capacity to be able to make things right. I think that the socialists are tapping into something where everybody feels there's something wrong with America, or a lot of people feel that there's something wrong with America, and that it's not producing what it promised. You know, what was promised to you in grade school is not the reality. I think that's a feeling that a lot of people have, and so the American socialism speaks very, and this is the main theme of the Socialist Temptation, does a very good job of speaking to fundamental American values. And I think that, you know, I learned this from Fred Smith, the founder of CEI, many years ago, that beneath our politics, there are certain values, and those values drive our politics. And there are three main American values, which are egalitarianism, a belief in equality, a belief that we're all equal, and that we should all have the same opportunity. There's a libertarian value, that the belief that the freedom is the main is a main value, and that we should have, as Americans, we need freedom. And there's a feeling, there's a value of community or tradition, a feeling that, that America is all about the communities that make it up. And socialism does a very good job of speaking to each of these values. It says that, that America is not an equal society, and we can make it equal by imposing socialist policies. It says that America claims to be a free society, but unless you have the agency, you can't actually really be described as free. And so it does a very good job of speaking to that freedom value. And finally, the very basis of the word socialism is about community. It's about the alliances that we have with each other. And socialism taps into the labor movement and says, we can help create a better America with stronger communities. So it speaks at that values level. And the trouble is that when you look at what socialist policies actually do, they undermine each of those values.
It seems that in most cases, maybe not all, but in most cases where socialism is implemented, you end up with some sort of a totalitarian political system, or you end up with capital controls on whether or not people are allowed to leave the country, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it doesn't happen everywhere. I mean, you would not say that those sort of things existed in the socialist Britain that you lived in. But why is it that so many times socialism ends up being accompanied by a political system that grossly infringes on individual liberty?
I think you're exactly right to point to those restrictions on emigration. You do see them at the in all socialist countries in one way or another. The Communist Manifesto of Marx and Engels talks about confiscating the property of anybody who wants to try and emigrate, and essentially capital controls, as there were in Britain, created that something very similar to that. You just couldn't leave the country with your wealth. You could only take up to, I think it was £5,000, and that was it. All the other wealth had to stay in the country.
So you did have capital controls in socialist Britain?
Oh, absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah, so in fact, it was one of the first things that Margaret Thatcher abolished when she came to power.
I think a lot of us are familiar with the phenomenon, for instance, of like British rock stars and things like that all left the country, during the 70s because of high taxes. But I was not aware that there were also capital controls.
Oh, yes, very much so. And so and you saw that John Lennon, that noted socialist, would sing the Beatles song "Taxman," which complained about Harold Wilson's super tax of 95% of all the wealth that the Beatles had earned.
That's right. That's 1 for you, 19 for me.
Exactly. But of course, it goes beyond that. So the more socialist a country is, the more it tries to control people, and it's especially important that when socialists realize that it's not just wealth and property that people take with them. It's the human capital of their brains and hands that they take with them when they leave. And so that's when you get to the stage of Berlin erecting walls to keep people in East Germany rather than to keep other people out. And eventually you get those the horrendous heartrending scenes that we still see in archive footage of East German border guards shooting people dead inches from the West German border as they try to escape.
The controlling aspect, does that come from, when it becomes clear that socialism's not working, and you already suggested this idea that they're not willing to admit it's not working. So is that where the crackdowns and the controls come from? Is that, it's not working, but we're determined to make it work no matter what, and we refuse to admit that it's not working?
I think that's very definitely part of it. But another part of it is is what you just referred to as well, which is that the new ruling class has to be able to retain its control, and has to be able to retain its control over people, because this is one of the, I think it's the central contradiction of socialism. Socialism claims to be democratic. The idea behind socialism is that you have popular control over the economy. So I don't know, at some level, how can you object to that? If the people want to control the economy, then, and we live in a democracy, so therefore this must be allowed. But when you start to think about it, you realize that the people can't control the economy. It's just completely impossible. You just Hayek's knowledge problem comes into play. But even if you assumed that they did have perfect information, the people as a body still can't control all the trillions of economic exchanges that happen daily. So therefore, the people's power gets delegated to bureaucrats or commissars or apparatchiks or whatever you want to call them. Those bureaucrats then, because they have the people's power behind them, become a new ruling class. This is why I say to everybody that the first book you should read about socialism is George Orwell's Animal Farm, because he beautifully illustrates what happens. The animals have to delegate the power, so they delegate the power to the pigs. The pigs start walking on their hind legs and change the wonderful slogan of all animals are equal to all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. That's what always happens in socialism, happens time after time, and it's an inherent feature. Democratic socialism becomes bureaucracy, which becomes bureaucratic tyranny.
Iain, would you address the issue of socialism and fascism? Because I tend to see the two as related, and yet you have Antifa out there which says we're anti-fascist, and yet my sense is most of them embrace socialism. And so I'm wondering if you could sort of discuss how those two are related.
I think this is a very important point. I talk about it a little in the Socialist Temptation, but I don't go into great detail. But the great economist Ludwig von Mises believed that the difference between socialism and fascism was just a technical triviality, I believe is
two letters.
Indeed. If you look at the beginnings of fascism in Italy, it was very much an offshoot of the socialist of the socialist belief. Mussolini always claimed to be a socialist, but what most democratic socialists in America claim is that fascism was basically an alliance between the fascist parties and big business. So therefore, fascism was capitalist, is what they claim. But when you look at what the fascists actually did to private industry, it's very different. Yes, there was definitely an alliance between the party and big business, but they did their level best to destroy small businesses. And they created state-sponsored cartels so that the big businesses would be beholden to the party. The idea that fascists were capitalists, I think, is completely and utterly discredited when you actually look at what the fascists did. Nevertheless, they are using this as a rhetorical, because the fascists did allow big businesses to continue. They use this as a rhetorical device to say that big business equals capitalism, and in lines with them is fascist. So that's
one more quick question. The violence that comes with socialism now. So you mentioned 3 different types of socialism. Sweden doesn't seem to have the violence that you get in the socialists that are coming up in America and Venezuela and other places. Is violence inherent to socialism, or is it inherent to some of the branches of socialism that you discussed? Or could you conceivably have a pure socialism that isn't violent? Because I don't know that we've seen a pure socialism that isn't violent and destructive of people.
Well, it's interesting when you look at Sweden, because the welfare state is so important to Swedes. They restrict access to it from immigrants, and so there is actually a very high level of violence in some Swedish cities, especially Swedish cities with very large numbers of immigrants, precisely because the immigrants aren't allowed access to the welfare state. So I think even in Sweden, there is evidence that the socialist policies there do contribute to a level of violence. But I do think you're right. I think if you look at what happened in Britain during the miners' strike of 1984, which was basically the last gasp of democratic socialism in Britain, when the miners tried to flex their muscles for the last time, you actually had. When I say armed, I don't mean they had firearms, but they had armed themselves with truncheons and weapons, basically armed battalions of striking miners and the people who had come out on strike in alliance with them, walking almost in military formations around the country and clashing with police. There was a very strong level of violence involved in that last gasp of democratic socialism in Britain, and of course, we see the violence of revolutionary socialists every day. Sadly, when you look at I do talk in the book about the Cultural Revolution in China, and the violence that is directed at anybody who attempts to retain the old ways under socialism. That is also, I think, inherent.
Iain, I have a couple more quick questions, and then we're going to open it up to our audience. So let me go ahead and ask the audience to, if you have questions, go ahead and either type them into the question and answer panel, or click on raise your hand so that we can acknowledge you. Right now we have two. Now we have three questions. So the questions are coming in. Iain, you mentioned the relationship, briefly, you touched on the relationship between socialism and communism. I think you described communism as some sort of an outworking of socialism. When I hear the idea of public ownership of the means of production, I think of Marxism, but you described that as sort of the central ethic of socialism. So what is I mean, they're not the same thing, but what is the relationship between socialism and communism?
Well, I think Marxist socialism was for a very long time theoretical, but then it was finally introduced as an actual working, well, sort of working political system by Vladimir Lenin. And I think a lot of socialists of my acquaintance in Britain would always describe themselves as Marxist-Leninists. And I think it's that Leninism that transforms the socialism of Marx into communism. I think Marx always said that he wanted that he saw socialism as evolving into communism, but the way Lenin did it, I think, is fundamental to how we would describe communism today. Certainly, the primacy of the party in all of this is very important.
And my last, well, I guess my close to the last question is, one time when I was in London, I was walking down a little side street and I looked over to my left and I saw a sign that said the Fabian Society. And we hear about Fabian socialism in the UK. What is meant by Fabian socialism, or what is the distinction between Fabian socialism and some of the other kinds of socialism that you were talking about?
Well, the Fabians named themselves after the Roman statesman Fabius Maximus, or Cunctator, as he was known, the delayer. He ran a sort of hit and run campaign, I think we would call it now, against the invading Carthaginian general Hannibal. So he basically just ate away at Hannibal's forces until Hannibal had to withdraw from Italy. So the idea of the Fabians was that they would eat away gradually at capitalism. So it's a marginal approach. You try and get a law passed, and then a few years later another law passed, and so another law passed. It's probably the most refined form of the democratic approach to socialism that you've seen. Basically, try and impose socialism by doing it very gradually over a number of years.
That sounds awfully familiar to what we what we see happening in this country, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I think that the gradual resurfacing of socialism, the way socialists took over the labor movement in America, which, as I explained in the Socialist Temptation, used to be very anti-socialist, unlike most other countries. In many ways, the labor movement actually stopped us from becoming socialist when the rest of Western Europe did. But the way they took over the labor movement, I think, was very Fabian.
Okay, so we have several questions from the audience. The first one is from Carrie Jones, and this is along the lines of the redefinition of terms. And Carrie notices that there's a lot of redefining of terms going on right now in society. Fascism is being redefined, racism is being redefined. And the question here is there some sort of a stealth redefinition of socialism as social democracy going on right now in the country? And I take it that question refers to the idea that are people calling themselves socialism and calling themselves socialists and talking about socialism in a way that's sort of redefining the term?
Yeah, I think there is a sleight of hand going on here. That, as I mentioned earlier, AOC and her comrades will talk about democratic socialism as if it was social democracy. And so you've really got nothing to worry about. All we want is a bigger welfare state where everybody's taken care of. But then when you look at the policies that the democratic socialists espouse, they're much more radical than any that are currently the case in the social democracies that they talk about. And interestingly, even when you look at the polling data, even when people who say that all they really want is social democracy, when they are asked what policies they approve of, if you give them a list of radical socialist policies, they will tend to say, yes, I support those. So there may be a form of doublethink going on here. Again, an Orwellian term, George Orwell's 1984. I think if you read 1984 and understand newspeak, redefinition of terms, and doublethink, the ability to hold two contradictory ideas in your mind and believe them both at the same time, then I think you're getting a long way to understanding modern democratic socialists.
So you made this point a couple times, but I think it's worth highlighting that a bigger, more robust welfare state is not necessarily socialist.
Yes, while an individual policy, such as redistribution of wealth, may indeed be socialist, you do not necessarily have to have the entire apparatus of a socialist state to produce that. So, as I say, popular control of the means of production, distribution, and exchange, in other words, either regulating the industries so tightly that they have no leeway for innovation, or actual outright ownership, that tends to degrade the tax base that you need to fund a large social democratic welfare state. And so most of those Western countries realized that they needed a capitalist economy to be able to fund their welfare state. So in that sense, they are not socialist.
that is one of the central problems of socialism, isn't it? That it concerns itself with the allocation of goods and services, but not with the production of goods and services, right?
That's exactly it, and this is one of the contradictions of socialism, that control of the means of production, distribution, and exchange tends to diminish the means of production, distribution, and exchange. My own personal experience, I saw the state of the British rail system after 40 years of public ownership. It had degraded to a state where it was literally unsafe to run trains. And so when we privatized it, we were unaware of just how bad this was. And so there were some major accidents just after privatization. Those were blamed on the privatization and not on the degraded state of the rail under public ownership.
We have another question from Bob Clark. I think it's a little bit tongue in cheek, but Bob says, what is the difference between a socialist and a Democrat? And I think part of what Bob is alluding to here is it does seem that the progressive left has really sort of become dominant in the Democratic Party right now in the U.S., doesn't it?
Well, indeed. If you look at policies like the Green New Deal, for instance, and especially the New Deal part of the Green New Deal, they are explicitly socialist. So anybody who says that they support the Green New Deal is essentially supporting socialism. This does not necessarily mean that all Democrats are socialists by any means. In fact, the great history of the Democrat Party in the United States contains lots of opposition to socialism over the years. I think it's fair to say that FDR was probably the closest to a socialist president the US has ever had. But do I think he was a socialist? Probably not in the end. But for instance, I don't know if any of you have read Arthur Herman's great book, Freedom's Forge, where he's an excellent historian. He talks about how when America entered the Second World War, and they needed to produce the great arsenal of democracy, as FDR said. The temptation was just to nationalize General Motors and so on in order to produce tanks. But FDR stopped short of that and actually got together with the head of General Motors and others and let private industry do its stuff. If FDR had been a genuine socialist, I don't think that would have happened.
Yeah, it seems like FDR, if you read Amity Shlaes, it seems like FDR was mostly just throwing things against the wall to see what would stick rather than being sort of an ideological socialist. We have a question from Bob Crawford. And Bob's question is, since there seems to be a significant accumulation of wealth at the top, is it any wonder that some of the less well-trained people, young people mainly, view socialism in a favorable light? Should we move to try to reduce the wealth difference between the wealthy class and the not wealthy class? So this is this idea of, I guess, if we have a large degree of inequality in our society, are we not asking for it?
I think I'm going to answer that question by making a slightly different point, which is that we can't underestimate the effects of the financial crisis on the growth of socialism, especially among the younger people, even millennials who are now approaching 40. When you look at what happened in the financial crisis, I talked about those three values earlier. The value of fairness. People thought bankers got away with it, and poor people lost their homes. When you talk about the value of freedom, people had been, the millennials who were coming out of college at the time had been promised the American dream, an affordable home, a career, and those suddenly seemed to be taken away from them. So,
hey, Ian, I think the bankers got away with it.
Oh yeah, well, so do I. Absolutely. Yeah. And finally, community. People saw communities destroyed by the lack of jobs and homes being repossessed. So yes, there was very definitely a feeling that that something was wrong with American society after the financial crisis, and socialism provides pretty easy answers to those. However, when you do what we do as in our day job and look at the policies that produced the financial crisis and the policies that made the financial crisis effects much worse after the financial crisis, then you realize that those were policies that were in some way heading towards socialism, and in fact, the correct approach would have been to remove the perverse incentives before the crisis, and to avoid things like bailouts and so on afterwards, which would have meant that the bankers didn't get away with it, and the bankers didn't have the incentive to cheat in the first place. So to answer the question, yes, there is a problem, and it's a problem caused by policy, but the correct answer is to move back towards classical liberal policies rather than socialism or socialism light, both of which make the problems worse.
Let me invite people to ask. We have time. We're going to have time for a few more questions. I think Dr. Matthews has another question, but we're going to have time for a few more questions. So again, if you have a question, you can either type it in the Q&A panel, or you can go down to the participant menu and click on raise your hand. And I see another question just came in. So let me invite people to go ahead and ask your questions if you have them. Dr. Matthews?
Iain, you were just talking about the issue of the millennials and the financial crisis, and they're seeing the expansion of income inequality and so forth. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because I would say it's largely the educated, upper middle, and maybe even upper income millennials who are embracing socialism, whereas out in the hinterlands, the people who were hurt most by jobs being transferred overseas and so forth, lower educated, non-college trained whites and so forth, they are the ones that tend to be the biggest Trump supporters. So this strikes me as a sort of anomaly that you've got young, high, if they don't have high incomes yet, they have every expectation of being able to make high incomes at some point in the future, sort of embracing socialism, whereas those who might have been hurt most by capitalism and offshoring jobs and so forth are Trump supporters.
Yeah, I think that one of the things I do talk about in the book is the radicalization of the American campus and the American academy. At about the same time as things were ramping up to the financial crisis, we saw the data show that there was a significant decrease in the number of conservative members of the academy, and at the same time a significant increase in the number of radical left socialist members of the academy. This then translated into the syllabuses that people are being set. My friend Phil Magnus, who I imagine Tom knows as well, has done a survey of American college syllabuses and found that the second most prescribed book in all of college syllabuses, if you leave aside elements of style and things like that, is the Communist Manifesto. And it's not being prescribed in economics classes because, thankfully, economics is one of the few remaining sensible professions in the academy. But it is being prescribed in English class, in history class, in sociology, in anthropology, in any of the classes that have the word studies after them. So a huge swathe of the humanities is being exposed to communist ideas and socialist ideas in their rawest form, without anything to balance them. And I think that is probably the answer to to the problem you just raised.
One more quick question before we go to that other question. Is there a tipping point where we have gone so far towards socialism that there is no turning back? And I think of the National Health Service in Britain. Even conservative members of parliament will tell you there's no turning back. People love their socialized medicine. We're just going to have to live with it. Is there a tipping point where we have embraced so much of the socialism agenda and so forth that we are now a socialist country?
I don't believe we're there yet, because we don't have things like the National Health Service yet. You know, I think the welfare system. Well, indeed, but I think the welfare system is, you know, it's pretty much the closest thing we have to that. I think if a universal basic income gets established, then I think that would become the American version of the NHS very, very quickly. One good thing, though, about Britain that I should point out is at some point people stopped believing socialists. So we saw in the last general election, Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, presented the most radical manifesto, radical left manifesto that Britain had ever seen. It promised free everything to people, basically anything you can think of that you might want was going to be provided free to people. One Labour MP said, why not provide free Sky subscriptions, the popular cable service over there? And the British people just realized that this was just way over promising. There was no way it could be delivered, and just stopped believing him, and Corbyn went down to the biggest defeat in history in modern times.
Well, it's interesting because the British people have a cultural memory of socialism, don't they? Which we in the US do not have. So it's almost like, you know, we're sort of poised to make some of the same mistakes that other countries have made and learned from.
Well, indeed, I do worry that you might actually have to make the mistakes before you can learn from it. I think America's been inoculated against socialism thanks to things like an anti-socialist labor movement that I mentioned beforehand. I think business in America used to believe in promoting freedom. I think it doesn't do that anymore. I think the phenomenon of woke capitalism has changed that. So I think some of those inhibitors against socialism may have either disappeared or be in the process of disappearing, and that does worry me.
Okay, we have a question from our friend Jeannie Short. Jeannie, go ahead.
Hey, Bob, Tom, this is Gary.
Gary Short, okay.
Jeannie's sitting here. First of all, thanks, Ian. I thought your presentation is great. I really enjoyed it a lot. And I want to second your reference to Phil Magnus. His work recently has just been spectacular, particularly on the 1619 project. And to the degree that any of you are aware of the New York Times Magazine and the spread of all this nonsense, Magnus is really taking it on a lot. And then, Tom, you mentioned at the beginning how Ian's topics or titles are provocative. There's a very provocative title by a local economist, Bob Lawson and Ben Powell, called "Socialism Sucks." And I'd be interested in Ian's thoughts on that book if he's read it. You know, you're appealing to different audiences and all, but it definitely makes it very clear where they stand. And I think it's a great book. I haven't read yours, but look forward to it.
Yeah, I know Ben personally. I've shared a drink with him on European tours in the past. The excellent writer. He and Bob did a fantastic job. I love Socialism Sucks. It's a perfect compliment to me, as far as I can see, to my book. My book talks about what might happen in America. His book talks about what has happened elsewhere. And I think that's right. And I'm glad you brought up Phil's work on the 1619 project, or the 1984 project, as we should now probably call it, given the way that they've been rewriting their own history.
It's and the way they've done that, it really is unbelievable. That the changing the language, used to claim it was history, now it's just journalism. It's just unbelievable, and not acknowledging how they've changed. I think she's deleted half of her tweets and changed what she claims she did in the past. But Phil's a pretty good historian and able to dig out all that stuff, I guess, from, I don't know, like apparently once it's on the web, you can't erase it. I don't know how all that works, but he does a great job.
Thanks so much, Gary. We have a question from Chris. Chris wants to know, can you explain the motivation or declared intent of socialists to disrupt the Western nuclear family structure? So I guess the question is here is, what is the relationship between socialism sort of as an economic philosophy, but yet sort of the attacks that we often see by socialists on things that don't seem to be particularly economic, like families and things like that?
Here we get into the question of public goods, the social goods, and in the socialist state, the state has to be the fountain origin of all of those goods. So therefore, the socialist state becomes naturally suspicious of anything that produces those sort of goods in competition to it. So this is why socialist states are almost always openly hostile to religion. Religious organizations, the civil society that is produced from the religious comity, they produce social goods in competition with the state. So everywhere you look at socialist countries, they either try to suppress religion or co-opt it. For instance, the Church of England was pretty heavily co-opted through a march through its institutions by socialists. In China, they attempted to destroy traditional religion. Cambodia, of course, was the worst example of all of that. But the family itself is a producer of social goods. Extended families, family community networks, they all help produce these goods. So socialist states have to be opposed to the family. I forget which country it was, but that had the slogan, "The state as a mother, the state as a father." But that is what the socialist state in the end wants to become. It wants to supplant the role of biological father and mother and replace it with the state as father and mother. And we see it time and time again.
It's really interesting. In Jonah Goldberg's latest book, he makes the point that, socialism is an appropriate way to run a family, according to their abilities, to each according to their needs. I mean, we are very often socialist and communist in the way our families function and our neighborhoods function and things like that. So you would think socialism would love the family for that reason, but you can't get away from this greed to sort of subsume everything, I guess.
Oh, absolutely. There is an element of communism in some civil and socialism in some civil society organizations. If you look at the Israeli kibbutz, for example, the Israeli kibbutz is often described as, well, this is what a socialist state would look like. And in fact, that's why Stalin actually agreed that Israel should become a member of the United Nations, was because he looked at the kibbutz model and thought that Israel was going to become a socialist country because of that. However, even in the kibbutz, there are some jobs people don't want to do. So in the end, the kibbutzes had to import labor from outside and pay them to do those jobs. So the kibbutz is probably the highest level where socialism actually works, and even there, it starts to break down very quickly.
When Gary Short asked his question about Bob Lawson and Ben Powell's book, The Socialism Sucks, that was actually a great transition to the question I wanted to close with, which is, are there suggestions in your book, or do you have suggestions for how we can rebut the socialist temptation? As policy organizations, right, as IPI and CEI, this is part of our job, right? Part of our job is educating the public and explaining to them why socialism doesn't work. So it strikes me that to the degree that socialism is gaining popularity, to that same degree, we're not doing a good enough job. So I wonder, what are your thoughts on how we can communicate to demographics and to generations that seem to be in the thrall of socialism? What are the good arguments against that?
Well, I think there are two things that we have to do. The first is to, socialists always say that one of the roles of a socialist is to heighten the contradictions of capitalism. You know, it claims to be about wealth, but there are so many poor people around, heighten the contradiction. We should be doing the same thing to socialism. You know, the question earlier about how socialism claims to be democratic, but always collapses into bureaucratic tyranny. That's a great example of the contradictions that we need to be highlighting. But I think more fundamental than that is something that our policy organizations have done a very bad job of doing, which is speaking at that level of values that I mentioned earlier. We do a great job of talking about GDP growth, and we have graphs and charts and everything, but that's speaking at a different level. We need to be speaking at the level of values. We need to be talking about how capitalism contributes to greater equality over time, how capitalism enables agency, how capitalism actually allows communities to thrive. And that's something I think we've forgotten how to do. Some of us are better at it than others. I think Steve Horvitz at Ball State University is really good on the role of capitalism in promoting equality. So I think we need to get back to that level of values. And unless we talk at that level of values, we're always going to miss some people.
That's really helpful. I really appreciate that. Let's wrap things up now. Let me thank so much Iain for joining us today, for setting aside time for us. And let me remind all of our attendees that if you'd like a copy of Iain's book, contact Addie Crimmins. I think her email address is addie@ipi.org. Her email address is also in your Eventbrite confirmation for this event. We'd be happy to set you up with a copy of that book. So we'd be delighted to do that. Let me also remind everyone again that our next event next Tuesday is our pregame show and social hour before the first presidential debate. We'd love to have as many of you as possible join us for that. And let me remind you that this event will be recorded and archived, so you'll be able to share it with friends that you think would benefit from it or would enjoy seeing it. So Iain, thank you so much for joining us. Good luck with the book. You're doing the Lord's work. It's a very important, timely topic. So thanks so much for doing it.
It's been an absolute pleasure being with you today, Tom. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks very much. And with that, I will wish you all a good afternoon and thank you once again for joining us.